Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Soy Daniel Sánchez,
Good
técnico de
afternoon.
colegios en
My name is Daniel
Monitorizacio.
Sanchez. I am a technician in the Passive House platform.
El informe
And
que
in this
vamos a
presentation, we're going to present the report and
colegios
conclusion of the school monitoring study that we carried out in
hemos hablado
2017-2018.
en otras
We've
ocasiones, en
talked
diferentes
about this on other
colegios,
occasions,
para
at
mostrar un
previous
poquito, vamos a
conferences,
explicarlo un poquito más
but in
técnico,
this
vamos a mostrar
case,
algunas
I'm going to
gráficas,
make it a little bit more technical, show you some graphs, different patterns that were identified of
Bueno,
interest.
obligatorio
So,
decir de dónde viene esto, ¿no?
it's
PEP
important to give you some
es
background
una
details.
trabajamos en
PEP is a non-profit making
diferentes
association working in three
ámbitos,
different areas: social, institutional, and technical or
cada uno de
professional.
estos ámbitos, todas
In
nuestras
each of these
acciones
areas,
se enfocan
all of our
a
actions
objetivos
focus on each of these areas or various of these areas, or all of them at the same time.
en concreto. La
Specifically,
inspección de colegios se encuentra, digamos,
in the case of school monitoring, that's at the centre of this process. It's a challenge that we are really dedicated to and we've worked on very hard. And we would like to touch upon these three spheres. Socially, because of all of these students and teachers and the populations where these buildings can be found. Technically, because of what this implies for buildings in terms of their monitoring. But if any changes have to be performed afterwards, this entails a very important technical component. And institutionally, because the competences of educational centres lie with the administration, and there are many people in the administration who are users or relatives of people that work in those buildings. So we believe that schools encompass a bit of all of these different aspects. Just to give you an insight into where this project comes from on school monitoring, well, this graph represents the landmarks, the highlights in 2008 when the platform was created, all of the different conferences, seminars that were organized, the people that were responsible for these conferences. And the idea was to try to determine exactly how we could monitor CO2 concentrations using sensors in the classrooms in schools. So, as a result of specific monitoring actions, we discovered that the values were not very good. So the idea was to give greater visibility to these aspects in these conferences and seminars. Specifically, during the monitoring of one of these projects, which served as a precursor of this project in 2015, it was carried out by somebody that was hidden in PP at the time, the president, Dina Odiarte, and it was carried out in a classroom in a secondary school in November. And it was discovered that the children were cold. So temperature measurements were taken, but in addition to temperature measurements which confirmed that it was cold in the classroom, they also detected high CO2 concentrations. And that's how all of this began. With specific actions, we had become aware of this. This had become clear. But we couldn't just do anything with just this test. So we decided to promote doing a complete project. We decided to roll this out on a large scale to make the whole country aware of this problem. This was proposed to the Assembly in 2016. It was approved in a vote and it was launched in 2017. Sensors were manufactured expressly for installing in the schools in collaboration with the PEP platform. And we realized that the error margins were within the permitted tolerance levels. It was implemented during the 2017-2018 school year. And in the following year, we gathered all of the data for processing. This was carried out by the University of Burgos under an agreement that we'd signed with them. And since 2019, that report was finalized to present the conclusions. At the beginning of 2020, we plan to publish the report in March, in fact, on the 31st of March, and we aim to present the report in person. But for reasons we're all aware of, that had to be postponed, and it's been on standby until the current date, and today we're presenting it here. So basically, we have to answer the following question. Are our schools efficient or deficient? Okay, how was the monitoring carried out? We monitored an entire school year, nationally. 50 schools in Spain were initially invited, eventually only 43 did. But those 43 schools had 20,000 students and more than 235,000 square meters. It was a heterogeneous sample and a random sample. It included public and private schools, or state and private schools, old and new schools. Some had been reformed, other were as they were when they were built. Therefore, we wanted to obtain a sample that would be valid, because the real sample had to be heterogeneous. 2 sensors were installed in each classroom, and one sensor would measure indoor temperature, relative humidity, and also CO2 concentration. The other sensor would measure exterior facade temperature and outside temperature, and also data from the AMET Association, the meteorological agency, were also included. In total, we validated more than 700,000 parameters, making it the largest study of this type that's ever been performed in Spain to date. Here are some photographs of the installation of these sensors. There you can see a sensor installed in one of the classrooms, and in the center of this slide, each school, using a single code, could view in real time exactly what the levels were in terms of temperature, CO2 concentration, etc. And this was also available on the platform. So our approach was based on these 3 basic parameters. There are many others that can be measured in terms of indoor air quality. There are many parameters to measure, but we believe that 3 parameters are the most important for interior air quality, and which we have to address first. And if we can correct these, then we can probably correct many others. Specifically, temperature on a range of 20 to 25 degrees, relative humidity 40 to 60%, and CO2 concentration below 1,000 ppm. Those would be the adequate ranges to achieve air quality on which the results of this study are based, to achieve adequate air quality. If we gather all of those data, we could do the following, as we did. We included them in a Snyder's comfort graph. This graph shows that the central trapezoid, which is darker, gathers the optimum comfort area, and the one which corresponds to the lighter grey area corresponds to acceptable areas, which would be outside of the comfort range. But this only measures 2 variables, which are temperature, horizontal temperature, and also relative humidity vertically. So what happens if we add the CO2 concentration variable to these measurements? These are the results. This is the result, the basic result, and the most important finding or conclusion of the reports that we're presenting today. 16% of the time, comfort conditions are maintained. This means that 84% of the time, school classrooms in our countries are outside the comfort range. That means they fail. Schools in our country fail on this point, because 1 of every 6 hours is the only time when the air quality is good, and that is striking. This result is a general result. It is an average result for all schools. The report was prepared for each school individually, and then the schools were grouped according to different climatological areas. Climatology was applied in terms of similar climatological conditions. These are distributed in the map using a color code, and they would correspond to different climatological conditions established by building a technical code. If we look at each of these weather conditions or climates, we could consider that the general average for Spain is not representative of each school or each place, because it's possible that schools in one place could be very bad, whereas schools in another area have very good results. But if we look at the continental Mediterranean climate and schools in that area, only 20% of the time, or 20.5% of the time, they achieve the adequate comfort range. This range is the best of all of the ones that we'll see. It doesn't mean it's the best, it means it's the least bad, or the less, because only 20% of the time classroom climates adequate. If we move towards the coast, it's 17.1%. If we now look at warmer climates, which are even more mild in the winter, it falls to 15.69. And in the latter two cases, it's interesting to see that the percentage decreases. But it's supposed that the climates have less severe winters, and the summer months, well, the classrooms are empty and are not taken into account in the report. So it's interesting that there's a decrease. If we now look at the coastal Atlantic climates, then it's 15%. So the climate there is a little colder, but there's also more humidity because they're close to the coast. In the case of continental Atlantic climates, which are more severe in terms of winter conditions, then the temperature decreases to 11.5%. So we're talking about 16% as an average in terms of the time in which air quality is okay. So it's not a question of representing whether there are good or bad areas. The thing is that all of them are on a range of between 11 and 20%, which is at no time an adequate percentage. Having said that, and with those results clear, in this presentation we would like to now we'll now move on to the more technical version of the presentation. The platform is going to disseminate this, promote this, and present it wherever we can. So there'll be simpler presentations that are easy to understand, but here we would like to present a technical presentation with graphs because we believe that the forum deserves it. It's the right place, and we've identified common patterns that can be applied to different climatological conditions, different time periods, different schools depending on their age. So they're applicable, and they will provide a snapshot applicable to all. In many cases, there's no time difference between the interior and exterior temperature with either zero or minimum insulation. We've often seen that schools have difficulty in maintaining temperatures within an adequate range. This means that in addition to that minimum or zero insulation, there are air conditioning systems that are either insufficient or not being used or not operative. And the patterns in terms of classroom use are reflected in the graphs where CO2 concentrations very clearly are grouped in specific ranges, as with temperature measurements and relative humidity. And this was not surprising because we'd had news of this, that in warmer climates, schools are hotter, but they also, children are colder in the winter in the same schools. And there's been cases of interior relative humidity levels that are very low or very high, or actually outside the range. So if we look at the details, I'm going to show you different graphs, monthly and weekly graphs, as well as daily records in different formats and from different schools selected at random, without any preference for one or the other, and not wanting to put any of these schools under the microscope. In this example, we can see the temperature ranges: indoor temperature, interior temperature, which is different, which differs from exterior temperature. In a specific week, we can see the variation. This means that insulation is zero or very scarce, but not just in the case of cold. This also occurs in situations of great heat. In a hot month, for example, in this school, we can see that the temperatures are fairly high, and there's no variation there. The exterior insulation conditions are not adequate. They're non-existent, in fact. So what happens when trying to maintain temperature conditions and when schools have difficulty in maintaining temperature conditions? In this school, this is a cold month in the school, January, and we can see that in January the temperature range falls below 20 degrees when the heating is not operating or when the ventilation system is not operating. And when it does operate, there's a lot of variation. It rises, it falls. That's the temperature. And it's below the optimum range, and it's difficult for the school to maintain the optimum temperature. And we can also identify or show this other pattern corresponding to CO2 concentration in the classroom. This is a 5-day period, and on each of the 5 days, CO2 concentration increases at the beginning of the class and then decreases rapidly at the end of the class, and it maintains the very low range at night or the afternoon until the next day. And at the weekend, it's very clear that these concentrations are very low. So these are the moments of CO2 concentration marking peaks of over 2,000 or even 3,000 in this specific example. But this is something repeated in in all of these different climate conditions. If we now look at not just we change month and a different week and different climate in another school, we can see that this school has difficulty in maintaining the temperature. It's always around 20 degrees, sometimes it rises to 21. But when classes are about to start, it's below 15 or even 16, around 15 or 16. And there's also a coincidence in the increases and decreases in temperature. If we look at the CO2 concentration graphs, we can also see that this increase, we can also see this pattern reflected in this graph, and this may be due to ventilating the classroom during the breaks or at midday. And when that ventilation is done, CO2 concentrations fall, as does temperature, which then has to be recovered by the system. Now let's look at one day, another school, and this pattern is clearly repeated. It's around 20 degrees, sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but in general, it's not within the comfort range, and CO2 concentrations always shoot up at certain times during classes. And in another school, the same example. The climate in this area was less severe. It's a warm climate. It's a warm month. And we can see the pattern, the decrease during breaks and lunch times. This classroom is used in the afternoons, and we can see clearly how it decreases during lunchtime and break before increasing again when the class is used. This is something that we'd actually expected, as shown in these graphs. But if we now look at the Snyder graph for each month, we can see how these ranges are grouped. We can see that on each day, well, not each day, but in grouped ranges, the temperature will begin at a colder temperature. It will then increase as the day progresses. Temperature increases, humidity increases, and it changes from green to red, accompanied by increases in CO2 concentrations. This is grouped, and it can be marked within a month. Another school in an area with a similar climate conditions presents the similar results. But it's not just in one month. It's something that is repeated throughout the year. This is another school located in an area with a less cold climate, but we can see the grouping of these different results. I can't show you any more examples because there's no space on the slide, but the same results were obtained for all schools. So temperature always moves in this direction. When the conditions are good, or green in this case, then in other situations they will be out of range, and red, which is when adequate CO2 concentrations have been surpassed. So in warm climates, children in schools have to endure hot conditions. As you can see here, there are many records that have been registered of temperatures outside of the appropriate range. And this is nothing new. When it's hot, you can see on the news that there may be schools that have asked for classes to be suspended due to the heat. This is an example from March, but if we were to mark the temperature range of 20 to 25 in a warm climate, we can see that they are often above 25 degrees on repeated occasions and constantly. There may be a heating system, but it may be poorly regulated and be contributing more heat than necessary. And it's very possible that that month may not have been so cold in terms of exterior temperature, or, for example, there may be inadequate solar radiation protection or whatever. The surprising thing is that this also occurs in cold conditions. For example, a school in a warm climate in February where the kids are cold in the classroom. As you can see there, the temperature range is marked by the red curves, and the green curve indicates that they only managed to fall within the appropriate range on very specific occasions. And in another school in a city in a warm climate in the month of January, we can see similar results. So not only the children feel hot and cold in these different times of the year. And in other climates, relative humidity levels are below 40%. On many occasions, in dry climates, this is one example, here's another, a dry environment, dry atmosphere can also have adverse effects. And there are other results that show the opposite results. Many of the measurements are above 60%. Interior, humid environments can give rise to the proliferation of bacteria or pathologies, and also respiratory disorders. Well, to summarize, all of the graphs that I've shown you are available in this monitoring project, which we will publish and share with everybody. We will try to present the reports wherever we can. And we believe it's very important to report the conditions in classrooms because we have to make sure that they're good and adequate. It wasn't the objective of this project, of this study, but the conclusion was very clear. Schools have to be properly ventilated, maintaining temperature and relative humidity conditions. Ventilating schools, but not just any way, given the current circumstances caused by coronavirus and the return of children to schools. Well, authorities' recommendations have to stress the importance of properly ventilating classrooms in schools. One of the best techniques for preventing the propagation of the virus is good ventilation of classrooms. And we're even proposing opening windows. So what happens in schools that are already cold when they have to open their windows in the month of January or February? Well, the thing is they're going to feel much colder. Evidently, they're not ready to be able to deal with that situation. But we have a solution. And to conclude, well, the conclusions are very clear. This is a problem. It's evident because it's been demonstrated, but it can be reversed. The greatest problem we will face will be not acting to remedy the problem. We know what to do. We can measure these aspects. We have the technical skills and capacity. It doesn't matter what your profile is, men, women, children, students, teachers, or construction professionals. This is relevant to all of us. It applies to all of us. You have to obtain information, advice, communicate this report, promote it, and demand that the authorities act and correct the situation. So that was our aim here with this presentation. That's the end of the presentation. If you would like any more information about the report, you can contact the PEP platform through these contact details, and thank you for your attention.